Los Angeles, the Mocambo nightclub, late September 1954. Marilyn was halfway through her rendition of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend when someone entered from the side door, moving quietly through the shadows near the stage. The room was packed with studio executives, columnists, and actors who'd come to watch her sing at a private charity event. She'd been asked to perform as a favor to the organizers, and she'd agreed without hesitation. But now, with the lights hot against her face and the crowd leaning forward in their seats, something felt different. Someone was walking toward the stage with deliberate slowness, and the attention in the room began to split. If you've made it this far, you already know these aren't the stories they tell in documentaries. This is what happened behind the cameras, in the rooms where power decided who mattered and who didn't. Subscribe to hear the rest, because Hollywood never told you the full story. The man wore a fedora pulled low and a long coat that seemed too heavy for the California evening. He didn't rush. He didn't look around nervously. He moved like someone who belonged there, even though no one recognized him. Marilyn noticed him first because performers always notice movement in the crowd. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes flickered toward him for just a second. The band kept playing. The audience started whispering. By the time she reached the second verse, half the room was watching her and half the room was watching him. He stopped at the edge of the stage and stood perfectly still. Marilyn finished the song, holding the final note longer than she'd planned, giving herself time to decide what to do. When the applause came, it was scattered and distracted. People were already turning in their seats, trying to get a better look at the man. He didn't remove his hat. He didn't speak. He just waited as if he'd been invited. Marilyn set the microphone back on its stand and walked toward him with the kind of grace that made people forget she'd ever been nervous about anything. She leaned down slightly and said something no one else could hear. He nodded once. Then, without warning, he reached up and took her hand. The room went silent. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was careful, almost formal, like an old gesture from another era. Marilyn stepped down from the stage and stood beside him. And for a moment they were just two people in a crowded room, completely separate from everyone else. The whispers turned into questions. Who was he? Why was he here? And why did Marilyn look like she'd been expecting him? Before anyone could approach them, Victor Lansing stood up from his table near the front. Lansing was a producer with enough power to greenlight pictures without asking anyone's permission, and enough arrogance to believe his opinions were facts. He'd been drinking since before Marilyn took the stage, and his voice carried across the room with the kind of casual cruelty that people in Hollywood had learned to tolerate. "Well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I guess even Marilyn needs a bodyguard now. Can't blame her. When you've spent half your life bouncing between foster homes and bad decisions, you learn not to trust a room full of strangers." The laughter that followed wasn't universal, but it was enough. A few people at his table smiled uncomfortably. Someone coughed. The man in the fedora didn't react at all. Marilyn's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted. It wasn't shock. It wasn't outrage. It was the quiet recognition that someone had just crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, and everyone knew it. Lansing leaned back in his chair, satisfied with himself, as if he'd just made a clever observation instead of weaponizing someone's childhood in front of a crowd. Marilyn looked at Lansing for a long moment. She didn't look hurt. She didn't look angry. She looked like she was deciding something. The man beside her remained perfectly still, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The room waited. Lansing smiled, expecting her to laugh it off or walk away. But Marilyn didn't do either. She walked toward his table with the same measured grace she'd used to leave the stage, and when she reached him, she spoke quietly, her voice low enough that only the people closest could hear. "Mr. Lansing," she said, "I didn't realize you were still telling jokes from the 1940s. I thought your career had moved on." She paused, letting the words settle. Or maybe it hasn't. The smile on Lansing's face froze. It wasn't a harsh insult. It wasn't loud. It was simply true, delivered with enough precision that everyone in earshot understood what she meant. Lansing had been a mid-level producer for over a decade, never quite breaking into the top tier, always close, but never quite there. And Marilyn had just reminded him of that in front of the exact people he'd been trying to impress. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. Someone at a nearby table cleared their throat. The band, unsure of what to do, started playing a quiet instrumental. Lansing tried to recover, opening his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Marilyn didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back to the man in the fedora, who still hadn't moved. She took his arm, and together they walked toward the exit at the back of the room. No one stopped them. No one said anything. The door closed behind them, and the room exhaled. It took a full minute before the conversation started again, but they were quieter now, more careful. Lansing stayed at his table for the rest of the evening, but no one came over to talk to him. The columnists who'd been sitting nearby avoided making eye contact. By the time the event ended an hour later, he'd left without saying goodbye to anyone. The story didn't make it into the papers the next day, but it moved through Hollywood's private circles with the kind of speed that only uncomfortable truths can achieve. People didn't talk about what Lansing had said. They talked about what Marilyn had said back. The man in disguise was never publicly identified. Some people claimed he was a friend from New York. Others said he was a bodyguard she'd hired after receiving threatening letters. A few insisted he was someone from her past, someone who'd known her before she became Marilyn Monroe. But no one knew for certain, and Marilyn never clarified. When a journalist asked her about it a week later during a press junket, she smiled and said, "Sometimes you just need someone to stand with you. It doesn't matter who they are." The journalist pressed for more details, but Marilyn changed the subject and the interview moved on. What people didn't know was that the man in the fedora had been arranged by Marilyn herself, not as a bodyguard, not as a romantic gesture, but as a reminder to herself that she didn't have to face rooms like that alone. She'd been dealing with comments like Lansing's for years, the kind of casual cruelty that people with power use to keep others in their place. She'd learned to absorb them, deflect them, move past them. But that night she'd decided she wanted to see what would happen if she brought someone with her, even if that person was a stranger she'd hired for the evening. His name was Thomas, and he was a character actor who worked mostly in theater. She'd met him through a friend who thought he'd be perfect for the role, someone who could blend into the background but still feel present, someone who understood that sometimes silence could be more powerful than words. She'd paid him $200 to show up, wear the disguise, and do nothing except stand with her. He'd done exactly that, and in doing so, he'd given her the space to respond to Lansing on her own terms, without feeling like she had to justify herself or apologize for reacting. The night after the Macambo event, Marilyn called Thomas and thanked him. They spoke for less than 5 minutes. He told her he'd been honored to help, and she told him she appreciated his professionalism. They never worked together again, but years later, after Marilyn's death, Thomas would tell a close friend about that night. He'd say that what struck him most wasn't the way she'd handled Lansing, but the way she'd walked out of that room afterward, not in triumph, not in anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd decided that her dignity was worth more than anyone's approval. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in how people spoke about Marilyn in private. The narrative that she was fragile, that she was difficult, that she needed constant protection, it didn't disappear, but it became less certain. People who'd been in the room at the Mocambo told the story differently depending on who they were talking to. Some emphasized Lansing's comment, others emphasized Marilyn's response, but almost everyone mentioned the man in the fedora, even though he'd never said a word. His presence had become part of the story, a symbol of something people couldn't quite name but recognized anyway. Lansing's career didn't collapse, but it stalled. Projects he'd been developing quietly fell apart. Actors he'd wanted to work with suddenly had scheduling conflicts. By early 1955, he was working on smaller films, still in the industry, but no longer in the rooms where decisions were made. People said it was bad timing, bad luck, the natural ebb and flow of Hollywood fortunes. But the people who'd been at the Mocambo knew better. They knew that in a business built on reputation, one moment of public humiliation could be enough to shift everything. Marilyn never spoke about Lansing again. When his name came up in conversation, she'd acknowledge it with a polite nod and move on. She didn't gloat. She didn't revisit what had happened. She treated it like any other unpleasant moment that had passed and didn't need to be relived. But the people who worked with her noticed something different in her demeanor after that night. She was less willing to absorb cruelty quietly. She was more willing to walk away from situations that felt demeaning. She started saying no more often, and when she said it, people believed her. There were still hard days. Still moments when the weight of everything she carried felt unbearable. Still times when the comments about her past, her intelligence, her worthiness would surface in ways that hurt more than she let on. But she'd proven something to herself at the Macambo, something that couldn't be taken away. She'd proven that she could stand in a room full of powerful people, face cruelty head-on, and walk out on her own terms. Not because she'd humiliated someone back, but because she'd refused to let them define her. The mystery of the man in disguise became one of those stories that people told when they wanted to illustrate something about Marilyn that the public didn't quite understand. It wasn't about the glamour or the tragedy or the chaos. It was about the control, the choice, the quiet strength that existed beneath everything else. People who only knew her from photographs and headlines couldn't see it. But the people who'd been in rooms with her, who'd watched her navigate moments like the one at the Mocambo, they knew. They'd always known. Years later, a young actress who'd just signed her first studio contract asked an older producer what it was really like to work with Marilyn Monroe. The producer, who'd been at the Mocambo that night, thought for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "She was tougher than anyone gave her credit for, but not in the way you'd expect. She didn't fight back the way men fight back. She didn't try to overpower people. She just refused to disappear. And that somehow was more powerful than anything else." The actress didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but years later, when she found herself in her own difficult situation with a director who thought he could humiliate her in front of a crew, she remembered that story. She remembered the man in the fedora. She remembered Marilyn walking toward Lansing with that measured grace, and she decided that if Marilyn could do it in 1954, she could do it now. She didn't yell. She didn't storm off set. She simply said what needed to be said, clearly and without apology, and walked away with the same quiet certainty. The Mocambo closed in 1958, and the building was eventually demolished. The charity event that night in September 1954 was never mentioned in any official records. Victor Lansing died in 1972, his obituary listing him as a respected producer who'd worked on several notable films in the 1940s. Thomas, the actor in the fedora, passed away in 1989, having spent his later years teaching drama at a small college in Oregon. None of them are remembered for what happened that night. But the story survived anyway, passed along through whispered conversations and second-hand accounts, never quite making it into the official narrative, but never quite disappearing either. Marilyn died in 1962, and the public remembered her the way they always had. Tragic, beautiful, complicated, misunderstood. The think pieces and the biographies and the documentaries focused on her relationships, her struggles, her famous moments on screen. Very few people mentioned the Mocambo. Very few people talked about the time she'd stood her ground in rooms where she wasn't supposed to have any power. Those stories weren't glamorous enough. They didn't fit the narrative of a woman who'd been destroyed by Hollywood. They suggested something more difficult to package, something harder to sell. But for the people who'd been there, who'd seen it happen, those moments were the ones that mattered most. They were the moments that revealed who Marilyn actually was when the cameras weren't rolling and the crowds weren't watching. They were the moments that proved she'd never been as fragile as people wanted to believe. She'd been calculating. She'd been deliberate. She'd been fully aware of the game being played around her, and she'd chosen her moves carefully, even when those moves looked like vulnerability. The man in disguise became a metaphor, eventually. Not for protection or secrecy, but for the parts of ourselves we bring into difficult rooms to remind us that we're not alone. Sometimes that's an actual person. Sometimes it's a memory. Sometimes it's just the decision to believe that we're worth defending, even when no one else will. Marilyn had understood that long before most people in Hollywood were willing to admit it was possible. The night at the Mocambo wasn't the moment that changed everything for Marilyn. There was no single moment like that, but it was one of many moments that added up over time, each one quietly redefining what people thought they knew about her. And in the end, those moments mattered more than the headlines. They mattered more than the scandals. They mattered because they were true in a way that most of what was written about her never was. The story of the man in disguise isn't about mystery or intrigue. It's about the decision to show up for yourself when no one else will. It's about understanding that dignity doesn't require an audience. It's about knowing that some battles are won not through loud confrontation, but through quiet refusal. Marilyn knew all of this, even when the world insisted she didn't. She knew it in 1954, and she knew it every day after until the very end. And maybe that's the part of her story that Hollywood never wanted to tell. Not because it wasn't true, but because it complicated the narrative they'd spent years building. It suggested that Marilyn Monroe had always been in control, even when she looked like she was falling apart. It suggested that the tragedy wasn't inevitable. It suggested that she'd been making choices all along, and those choices had meaning, even when they didn't save her. The man in the fedora walked out of the Mocambo that night and disappeared into the Los Angeles streets. Marilyn went home to an empty apartment and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about what had happened and what it meant. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt tired, the way anyone feels after standing their ground in a room full of people who'd prefer you stayed quiet. But she also felt something else, a small, stubborn certainty that she'd done the right thing. And for Marilyn Monroe in September 1954, that was enough. This is the Hollywood they never showed you. The rooms where power played out in silence, where dignity was the only currency that mattered, and where Marilyn Monroe proved, over and over, that she was never the woman they wanted her to be. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. Because there are more nights like the Mocambo, more moments that never made it to the screen, and they're all waiting to be told.